16.
Oh, yeah.
And I can't remember the other. Your kids in college.
Probably on there.
Looks to me like people are still filtering in, but I think we should probably start seeing anything. Yeah. Yeah. I think so.
Okay.
Although more people are coming in now.
What have you got here? Oh, great. Perfect. Okay, good.
I came from Todd's counting people.
See if we've lost anyone.
I think we should probably go.
Okay. Test, 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 test. Myself here. Great. Good morning, everyone. Nice to have you with us. Just checking. Everybody can hear okay? We noticed you were left-leaning. We thought that was very appropriate for Berkeley. We like that. So I'm joined by Nora Silver this morning, and we'll both do brief introductions of ourselves and then take you through some slides. And obviously what we want is a very interactive session, so please feel free to jump in and ask us questions, and if we haven't been clear, go for it. We're used to it, so no worries. I'm Lynn Lamarca Heinrich. I'm a senior consultant with Martz & Lundy. I also serve on the board of the Nonprofit Center here at Berkeley. Very pleased to be doing that. In my full-time day job, I do consulting with nonprofit organizations. We're a firm of about 30 senior consultants all across the country. So I work primarily with large nonprofit organizations, and I do a lot of board governance work, a lot of fundraising, strategic planning work. But probably about 70% of my clients right now are large cultural organizations. So I have a specialty with culturals in particular, and then higher ed, and then environment. Those are sort of my three big categories. So doing a lot of projects right now all across the country, about 12 different clients right now, and delighted to be with you all this morning, and nice to have you all here at Haas, and I'll let Nora introduce herself.
Okay, so good morning, everyone. We're going to hear from you in a minute, but I just wanted to welcome you. My name's Nora Silver. I'm the director of the Center for Nonprofit and Public Leadership here at Haas. How many of you were here when this center was here? Okay, great. Okay, this is one reason why we have this kind of session for you. So just to give you a little thumbnail, we now have a board fellows program where we place MBAs on nonprofit boards, 100 people a year. Okay, we have Melissa Kelly here who's actually hosting one of our board fellows. All right, I teach at the business school. I'm a professor. I teach strategy for nonprofits. I teach nonprofit consulting, and I teach philanthropy courses. Before I came to Haas, I founded or ran 3 different nonprofit organizations, and I've sat on many boards, and I'm the founding board chair of Board Match. Has anyone been to Board Match in San Francisco? Okay, yay. Hope you had a good experience. And finally, I just want to announce, I'm going to introduce later, Kathy Garza, who is an alum like you, and is our brand new director of alumni engagement, because we are after offering you more sessions like this year-round in ways that work for you, but we'll talk about that one later. So.
Great. So what we want to do is get a sense of all of you, sort of who's in the room, and so we can really make sure that we're answering some of your questions. So how many of you are actually serving in the nonprofit sector right now? Big percentage.
Wow.
Great. And how many of you are actually serving on boards of nonprofit organizations? Great. And why are you here today? Quickly. A few ideas. Great. Terrific. Others? Yes?
I was part of the board fellows.
Oh, great.
And so I'm a new alum, and I want to see how I can help and make some connections and learn something new.
Super. Good. Others? Yes?
I'm the COO of a nonprofit, and I'm having a terrible time with our board.
Honesty, we like that. Yes.
I'm a CEO of a nonprofit organization. I'm not having a terrible time with my board, but I want to see how we can continue to improve our board.
Great. Good. Yes.
I'm part of a board that we're having problems with being dynamic in the organization, so I'd love to get some strategies as a member, what I can bring back to the board.
Super. Great. Super. Others of you? Yes.
Oh, just getting some new ideas. I'm serving on a board and been on it for about a year, but I'm going to take over as president next year, so I'm
Great.
just looking for ideas.
Good. And in the back?
So I work in the hybrid between nonprofit and for-profit in the public sector. So I work with local elected officials, city councils. So it's a really difficult situation for them to do work that is a benefit to the community that they're supporting, but yet it's got all these different political challenges and interests. So I'm hoping to get some good information and insight.
Great. You know, we're finding with Haas students that there, and actually we're finding out in the sector in particular, that the boundaries between sectors are very blurred these days. So our students are moving between sectors, for-profit, nonprofit, public sector.
Right.
We're also finding those same issues and trends in the field. So very interesting. Yeah. Yes.
So I worked in the nonprofit sector for the last 5 years. Recently left to be a consultant on operational efficiency for nonprofits. So really here, interested in networking and learning, and
Great.
have had the pleasure of seeing now my third board and how it operates. And
Great.
every time it's different and interesting to see how boards operate. So also interested in some of the learnings there.
Good. Great. And final two, maybe. Yep. Go ahead.
So I serve on a couple of boards, one of which is very high functioning, and I don't have much of a role there in that board, but I'd like to have a better role. And
Great.
the second board is just minimally functioning, and I have a bigger role there.
It's funny how that happens, isn't it? Yeah.
I'd like to learn more and do more.
Great.
So I provide financial services to nonprofits, generally revolve around making big capital decisions, so interact with lots of boards of directors all over the country, and boy, it's a big variance in how that decision process works.
Yeah. Great. So what we want to do today, tying into some of the themes from this morning, we really want to, I think, provide you with a new perspective, maybe a little bit of how CEOs look at you as board members and vice versa, how board members look at CEOs. We're also going to share with you some new models. So hopefully as you sort of think about how to get your board to be a much more high-functioning and dynamic board, we'll give you some models and some tools from the toolkit that hopefully will really help you in terms of your work. If you go either way, you're in the staff role, working with board role, trying to work more effectively on behalf of the organization and with staff. So dynamic boards, sort of what are they? How do they work? What are the elements of them? Dynamic board members, where do they come from? What do they do? Sort of what that all looks like. But before we jump into that, you can buy your way into heaven with good board service is the concept of this. I've been teaching now at Berkeley 9 years, I think at this point, the nonprofit boards class. And I'm really pleased to actually be seeing many of my students now in my client engagements, which is really fun for me. And I say, remember we talked about that. Don't do that. Or remember, this is better to do it this way. So really fun to actually see students in the sector at this point and actively contributing. But a little bit about the sector. I've given you here just the number of 501c3 organizations. We're about to get the new Giving USA information out beginning of June. This is 2011 data. We'll have 2012 in a few months. But it gives you a sense of sort of the numbers of nonprofit organizations that are out there. So it's a very competitive landscape. The bulk of these are small nonprofit organizations. A very big percentage of them are operating budgets that are under $10 million. And actually another big, huge slice when we do under $5 million operating budgets. So the bulk of these are small nonprofit organizations. But if we look out over the next few years, what we anticipate is a flattening or a slight decrease in the numbers. And what we're seeing is through the economic times, lots emerging in nonprofit organizations or organizations that just haven't been able to make it in this past, the last few years in this really challenging environment. But the message here is a very competitive landscape. When you think about doing your work and working on behalf of nonprofit organizations, there are a great deal of them. What's always heartening to us is to look at the number of Americans that actually volunteer on behalf of nonprofit organizations. These numbers go through 2009. We expect these to actually be going up during a down economy. So we would anticipate in the next time around that these numbers will look even higher. And if we look at it in terms of a percentage of overall Americans that are volunteering, 27% actually actively volunteering on behalf of nonprofit organizations. And that's everything from serving as docents and volunteers to serving on boards and everything in between. So it's a very huge workforce when we think about it, a very dynamic workforce that really helps. So this is just a snapshot of Associated Press, and what I do often with my students is sort of talk about the context that they're walking into, or the environment that they're walking into, frankly, when they are thinking about board service. There have been a lot of very challenging ethical issues that have really affected the sector in the last few years in particular, and some very, very high-profile ones that have brought Congress and other watchdog institutions very actively engaged into the nonprofit sector where it wasn't before. So I think the good news here is it has forced the sector to become more professionalized. That's the good news. The bad news is that I think we've uncovered a lot of bad practices that need to be corrected. So for those of you that are struggling with your boards, and I think probably all of my nonprofit clients would say, the staffs would say that they're not as happy as they think they could be with their boards. And vice versa. I hear a lot from board members that their engagements with their organizations are frustrating, confusing, don't use the strategy capabilities that these board members have well. So I think it's a two-way street, but there's definitely a lot of frustration, and we were just in the field with a big survey looking at what is really impacting both CEO satisfaction and Chief Development Officer satisfaction, and number one on all of their lists is the board engagements. Board relationships are always number one or number two in all the surveys that we do consistently. So they're either bringing great joy, they're bringing enormous frustration, difficult. But these are difficult times, and good board service is more important than ever. So let me turn it over to Nora, and she'll take you through.
Okay, so I'm going to take you through this first, kind of lead you up to a framework. And the framework is all about not just what good boards do, but what great boards do. So those of you who are happy with your boards, wonderful. Pay attention. We're going to try to take you to the next level. Those of you who are not so happy, pay attention. We're going to try to jump you over just good, from good or bad to good to great. Okay? Here's the problem with boards today. Board members report that 97% that said that a high-performing board was important to a high-performing nonprofit, right? Everyone would agree with that, right? The same study, this was a study by McKinsey, I'll tell you more about this later, but the same group said 19% felt that they were tapping into their board's potential, the execution gap, right? 94% felt that their boards provided appropriate level of strategic guidance, but, here's the but, only 46% thought their boards could summarize their mission and vision. We're talking the most basic things, the biggest things you need to understand about a nonprofit. How are you going to lead it there if you don't know that? Again, the execution gap. Third point, 77% of respondents indicated a desire to improve board fundraising. 21% set development goals for their board members. How are you going to improve functioning if you have no goal? 38% provided training, and lastly, 16% of individual board members felt they received formal feedback. That's the gap we're going to try to address, right? What do boards need to do as a board and then as individuals to really be great? And so here's the framework. I want you to think in terms of three buckets. The middle one, the triangle, I'm going to unpack each of these, but the middle one really is about quality performance in three different areas. I'll explain those in a minute. The second one is about what are the enablers. Not just how do you perform well, what do you pay attention to, but how do you do your business are the enablers. And the third bucket is the environment. How do you respond or not to the environment? You heard Tom this morning talking about organizations that stay the same, right? Where do they end up? Akron, Ohio. Right? We're going to avoid that by paying attention to the environment. So let me talk about these 3 key responsibilities. Mission, remember, most board members couldn't repeat the mission or vision of their organization. So mission, leadership and resources, and monitor and improve performance. So let's go through these quickly. On the shape, mission, and strategic direction, it really is how do you shape that? How do you actively engage in decision making? Now, where do you see this? For those of you on boards, what's a common activity that you see a board focusing on this area? Strategic planning, exactly, okay? Now, the good news is that some boards do strategic planning. The bad news is they do it once a year, it's done, wash their hands of it, and that's it, okay? So, mission and strategic vision. Second area, leadership. Okay, you'll see first off the relationship with the CEO. It's assessing, nurturing, supervising, giving feedback, hiring, and if necessary, firing the CEO. Most important relationship there is. Board president, CEO. The next is about adequate financial resources. What's another name for that? What do we call it? Fundraising, okay? Fundraising. And a lot of the focus on nonprofits now is on earned income. Think your business backgrounds are going to help with that? You betcha. Okay? Budgeting, earned income. Providing expertise and access for organizational needs. What this talks about is not the board as a whole, but each individual board member making available his or her expertise as an individual to the organization. And then finally, enhance reputation of the organization. Those of you who are board members, how do you do that? What are examples of ways you can enhance the reputation of your organization in the community? I know you do it. What do you do? Talk about it. Talk about it where? Everywhere. Okay. What do you say about it? Good things. All right. All right. What else? Yes. Okay. Exactly. Okay. You're proud of it. You invite people in. Anything else?
You encourage the media to cover what you're doing.
Great. Great. Bring in the big guns. Bring in the media. What else? How many people have it on your resumes or LinkedIn profiles that you're a board member? Great. Okay. Okay. You link the reputation of the organization to all the people involved in it, right? You tell that story lots of different ways. And then the third line is about monitor and improve performance. And here we're seeing rising attention, especially to assessing risk. Assessing and managing risk is a big rising issue in the nonprofit sector. The second one about monitoring performance, another word for that in MBA land is dashboards. So a lot of our board fellows, for instance, are creating dashboards for their boards so that they can more clearly know what to pay attention to and how things are moving up and down. And then finally, improving board performance in 2 ways, and we'll go into this in a little more detail later. You assess best practice. You assess how the board as a whole is doing each year, and you assess how each board member is doing each year. So you got 2 different levels there. Okay. Yeah, somebody.
Board members, often the CEO is assessing them. The CEO is theoretically subject to the board member firing them.
Great question. Great question. What do you think is best practice? Who assesses the board member's performance?
Yeah, some kind of, at least on ours, we have a committee on trustees.
Okay.
We rack and stack everybody, and we talk about it, and if they're not doing it, we go and talk to them.
Okay, meet with him. Yeah, generally there's a board governance committee. So it's a committee of your peers. And often it's each board member gives input and then has a discussion, feedback discussion. It should not, the CEO is not the person to evaluate the board members just because of what you said.
It's like a great business opportunity to have a review process.
Exactly, exactly. And I'm going to give you a tool to do that before you leave here, okay? All right. What I want to tell you about this study is it didn't just notice which of the 9 things to pay attention to, but it gives you a what's the best practice, right? And what's the gold standard. So here we're looking at that bottom performance metrics, right? Performance management. So here is basic what you should do, board involvement in developing performance metrics, right? Makes sense, baseline. But really the gold standard is board works with the staff, not alone. Outcome-based metrics, not just any metrics, set for 1 to 3 year period, and comparing to other institutions. You see the difference going from left to right? You're talking really about a higher level of board functioning. The closer you are there, and the farther you are from here. Let's go back to that second bucket, enablers. Okay? These are the ones that really help to undergird the board to move toward higher performance. It's not what you focus on, it's the kinds of things that you have to move a board forward. And these are more of the process kinds of qualities in a board. So the first is really pay attention to the board size and the board structure. You know, organizations at different stages of development have different numbers of board members, but it should work for you and your stage of development and your structure. What's one thing that boards almost always create as they get older or as they mature in terms of structure? You have a board meeting and you have what else? Committees. Okay, so pay attention to committees. Committees work for efficiency, they work for digging down into information and bringing it back to the whole board. The actively managed board composition. I'm going to show you a skills matrix in just a minute that you can use because it's important to figure out not just who do you know who's willing to serve on a board, but who do you really need? What are the skills? What are the characteristics? What are the qualities that you need to help your organization make really strong decisions? Inspired board and community leadership, this is back to your question. There should be a board governance committee that really is looking at the board, how it's doing, who needs to be on it, any training needs. And then lastly, the simple administrative practices and processes made routine. I'll give you two examples. If I go in to work with an organization or I'm going to sit on a board, I want to know who prepared the agenda for the board meetings. You know, is it the CEO every time? Is it the board chair in collaboration with the CEO? Who's making the decisions of what goes before the board? It's an important one, agendas. Another one is elections. When are they taken? Has anyone ever been, many nonprofit boards run a July to June fiscal year, right? So April comes around and somebody says, oh, we need to look at a new slate of officers for next year. Anyone willing to serve? This is the opposite of what you want, right? You really want a year-long, at least, process. You want to see who's in the pipeline, what do you need to develop them to be, who's an incoming board president? Somebody, yeah, okay. How we need to identify you early on and get you ready for that job. So here's a skills matrix. It's just an example, okay? And I know it's hard to read, but the important thing is that you need to look at your categories are defined by what kind of spread and skills and expertise do you need on your board as you're trying to move it forward. So you have up here, you have age and you have race and ethnic backgrounds, geography and experience and employment and professional expertise and fundraising potential. But I want to just pull out one kind of example. I ran a domestic violence program, and we had lots of expertise in the area of medical and legal and women's rights and kids and anger management and all those things. But we were looking at purchasing and rehabbing 2 new facilities, and we had no real estate expertise on the board. Okay, we could get professionals to help advise, but we needed people internally over those next few years to help us make the best decisions. So just to think about what do you need to move your organization forward, that's really the key question. Thank you. Yes.
And we've done a lot of work on this and
yes.
kind of anticipating what our needs are going forward in terms of where we're taking the agency. I think the thing that's been hard for us, and I don't know whether you have some best practices, is the kind of where people come from in their thought, their thinking, their mindset. So if they're more concrete, sequential thinkers, their big idea, their operational. We were now just too many of us are kind of like linear operational thinkers, and we're finding that we can't break out on some of the things that we need to do to keep moving the agency forward. So I was just wondering if you could speak to kind of how to think about that, or what your experience has been, because it looks great on paper, but when you get us in the room, it's not so great.
Right. I understand. We actually did a survey of the MBAs, and we found out that they're almost all kind of engineering background thinkers and convergent thinkers, problem solvers, but not divergent thinkers. So I understand. I'll tell you a personal experience. I was on a board, and what we did was a kind of learning styles test to see where that board fell out. It was very fun. There was nothing heavy to it, but what it showed us was that we had a lot of really extroverted people, which we should have known, right? Everybody's trying to talk at the board meetings. Duh. Okay, but we didn't have people who were real planners. And just taking that tool, as we were thinking about who do we need on the board, helped us see what kind of thinkers we were trying to look for. With that tool also, it's called the Kolb Learning Styles. It also shows people in different professions tend to gravitate toward different styles. So then you would know where you were looking, right? So I was looking for the planners, right? I was in charge of board development. So I was looking for the planners then. And the first person I got, this was a domestic violence shelter, and it was an all-women board. And the first, I also wanted to bring on men, again, duh. And we went to the head of research at Clorox Lab. Okay? This is somebody who plans really, really far in advance. And he was brave enough to be the first man. He led us through our first strategic planning process. World of difference. Okay? But we found that out by looking at where the gaps were. You seem to know them, right?
I think the hardest thing is candidates in your resume. Somebody may know them.
Yes.
Maybe a professional, sometimes social. And I think it's hard to screen for that learning, kind of their learning style up front. And it's not like if you're asking someone to join your board, can you put them through can you take this profiling thing? And then,
you could, or you could ask them key questions. Okay. You could talk to anybody in HR. What would be the questions I would want to ask to determine if this person has this kind of thinking style? Okay. Or you can ask them. I mean, many people know their style, right? And we'll tell you. True. But those are a couple of options.
One thing we did is we had a major expansion of this independent school, and had to get the community involved. We were able to planning charrettes. We invited people in. This is basically for future board members. This is try before you buy. We got to see who was collaborative, who was could generate ideas, and who was not so much. And these were all basically parents at the school. And it was a pretty interesting and highly revealing. And so before you actually ask the person to join the board, you got to see what would it be like working with them. Right. That was extremely effective.
Does everyone know what a charrette is? No.
Well, a charrette is like a gathering to bring together kind of visioning about the future and planning, and it was exceedingly well done. We actually had a person who what she did was draw the ideas like a mural as we were having discussion, and so you saw around the whole room what the ideas were for the whole day. It was really pretty remarkable, and we got 5 board members out of that ultimately that we saw okay, try before you buy. We can work with these people.
Okay, good, great example. Thank you. Okay, let me go back to the third bucket, which is the external factors. Right? I can't say it any better than Tom said it this morning. The world is changing around you. You're not changing with it. You're going to be left behind. That is as true for nonprofits as any person or any other kind of organization. So it's changes in the underlying social issue. Look at something like criminal justice. I happen to have a daughter who was working on an immigration law for the country when guess what hit? Boston. Okay, you think that the feeling about immigration in the Senate was the same today as it was 2 weeks ago? I don't think so. Okay, the world changes quickly. Changes in the industry, changes in the philanthropic landscape. That's the third bucket that good board members really attend to. You're not just looking inward, you're looking outward and trying to bring that world and what you know about it, including future trends, into the organization. Okay, so these are the 3 buckets. The board responsibilities, those are the triangle, the board enablers, and the external factors. Those are the 3 buckets you're going to pay attention to. Now, what do you do with them, right? What you do with them are you look at internal factors, you look at these core competencies, skills of the organization and the staff, the income, how's that doing, and you put these together as a board member and you say, okay, where do we focus our attention over the next year? Right? You don't need to do all of these things equally. You need to pay attention to the ones that are most important. So how do you determine which are important? You've gathered all this information, you've got a pretty good sense of your organization, its strengths, the environment, the board itself. Here's a tool that can help you. Very simple matrix, and it looks at, there are 2 axes. One is the perceived importance of an issue, and the other is the performance of the organization. I'll give you a minute to look at it. So if something's very important, upper right corner, very important and you're doing well on it, you reinvest, right? You reinforce it, you reinvest in it. If something is you're doing very well, but it's low importance, you ask if you can redirect some of those resources elsewhere. That's not where you need to monitor, right? That's not where you need to really focus your attention and put a lot of energy into it. If you have poor performance and it's not important, incremental change to improve it, right? But that upper left quadrant where it's really important and you're not doing well, that's where you really want to invest in major change, major thinking about what can you do there. Now, it's your job, right? You looked at all these other factors. How do you put them in these quadrants? That's really the job of the board. That, for instance, would be a very, very productive strategic planning exercise, or even a board exercise, aside from a retreat. It's just a framework to help you see how you can take your organization from good to great. It's focusing. It's all about the focus and the discipline, which is priority board work for the next 2 years. Yeah. There is. How do you get it? Okay. Yes, there is. And I'm going to give you a reference for that. I'm not going to answer you in detail. There is an assessment tool that comes with this. Okay? But it does also mean that you have to have discussions, you have to have input from your staff, you have to look at the industry. I saw a survey a number of years ago of what do board members know the least about that they feel is most important for them to know about on the board. Any guesses? The industry in which you're operating.
Yeah.
Okay, if you're a housing industry, you hear from your executive director, maybe you have somebody else on the board who knows housing, but what's going on out there that I really need to understand? So there is a lot of information you have to gather. You're right. You're right. So let me just show you how one set of organizations used the tool that I'm going to tell you about and looked at their priorities. So this is an accumulation of many organizations in another part of the country. You can see the different leadership, the different board areas, the 3 areas of focus, right? And what this shows you is the importance they placed on, or how they thought their board was doing on the 9 different characteristics that go with the 3 areas, right? What is the most important to all these organizations? Money. Money. No surprise, but it sure makes it clear where the board needs to focus, right? It's this kind of tool that's going to lift you from just doing well to doing really well. It is not always money. That's interesting. We had a small alumni event in Silicon Valley a couple days ago, and we were talking about the alumni. These are young alumni, like 5 to 6 years out of school. And they wanted to talk about nonprofit boards. So we went and talked about nonprofit boards. And one of the people said, I really want to know how to sit on the American Red Cross board. And somebody else said, I looked at a board and you had to make an individual contribution of $50,000. And the whole room all of a sudden was very turned off from sitting on nonprofit boards, right? It's not, money is not always a driving force, just in anything else, okay? As you know, you've been to business school. What you know is strategy has a lot to do with it. I mean, look at Tom's examples today. He didn't say that the tire companies were after more money, or that's where they lost. They lost market share. They didn't have the right strategy. They weren't looking outside. So your focus can be very, very different. I run a center here at Haas School of Business, right? And yes, we raise about $1 million a year. Okay, that could be my focus. It's not. My focus is on, we serve the students while they're here 2 years, and we do a really good job. 79% of the students do something in our center, right? We're getting that right. And then we go out and say, create social impact in your life. Bye, have fun, right? Where's our opportunity? It's the alumni, right? Your needs, even if you were a board fellow here today, 10, 15, 20, 25 years from now, your interests are going to change, how you want to get involved is going to change, and we want to help you do that. So that's our focus. It's not always money. Okay? All right. I think that's it. Any questions about that kind of construct? You get the 3 buckets, you get the enablers, you get the environment, you get, use your disciplined thinking to get to those 2 to 3 things to focus on. Okay.
Great.
Sure.
So we're going to turn you from the larger group activity to sort of the specific elements of individual board members so we can get a sense of this. And really talk about how you can be a great board member. I think this is the key, and how if you're serving on a board right now, you can really step up your activity and really be even more valuable to the institution. So 3 big things when we think about individual responsibility of board members: the duty of care, duty of loyalty, duty of obedience. So let's go first to duty of care, which is really all about really sort of the basics of being involved as a good board member. So it's attending meetings. How many of you actually have attendance requirements for your boards? Only a few. And how about committee requirements? Great, that's even better. So most of my organizations, most of them are meeting quarterly, maybe 3 times a year or not more than that. Small nonprofits tend to meet more frequently because they use their board members more as staff members. They're sort of more in doing some of the jobs. But the larger organizations tend to meet 3 times, 4 times a year, and then also tend to have standing committees and ad hoc committee structures that they get the work of the board done through. And so each board member regularly sits on at least 1 committee, sometimes 2 committees. These are big commitments of time if you're thinking about doing this, and then requirements around attendance. And usually it's at least 75% of the meetings are required. And I strongly encourage my nonprofits to require attendance. Now, why? Why would that be key? Yep. Commitment. Why else? Yep.
Well, it keeps them informed
Right.
of what's going on.
Right. So if we don't have that, we have people coming in saying, you know, what do you mean the new business we decided to launch 5 months ago? I had no idea about that. What do you mean we're in trouble fundraising-wise? I didn't look at the projections, and I haven't been looking at the board packets from the last few meetings. So we've got big disconnects and an inability to actually continue to move the board forward and be really active and good agents for change. So really, attendance requirements, I strongly recommend them. Exercising independent judgment. So this has gotten more and more important as we've looked at some of the kinds of stories that I showed you early on in the New York Times, Associated Press, where we get this board group think. Okay, we sent out the packets, we all looked at all the materials, we're all, sitting in committee meetings, we're all just kind of sitting there saying yes, 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 whatever anybody serves us up, stamp, check, go to the next agenda item. So how could you inspire some really good independent thinking in your board? On tactics. Use your business experience. Come on. Take a flyer. Go ahead. Yes?
Well, sometimes something we've done is give them options.
Uh-huh.
Right? We're thinking of this option, this option, and this option.
Mm-hmm.
And then they're required to flesh it out. It
Yep.
requires them to get engaged
Yep.
more.
Yeah, very good point. So we're not just solving it for them, we're telling them the issues, and then we're saying management has really thought about it, and we could see or imagine 3 different scenarios for working through this. This one, this one, this one. You could even break them down. If you have a big enough board, break them down into small groups. Each of them take one of those topics, come back and share it. So literally they're in the middle of a discussion about that. They're thinking about strategy. So it really requires, frankly, a careful consideration on the part of management about how they structure board meetings. And also, if you're going to be an incoming board chair, that you are thinking about how you are encouraging that kind of dialogue and discussion and those strategy discussions. Lots of my groups think about every agenda has one big meaty issue that they're going to ask for a discussion around. It's not just committee reports, financials. Yes, we've all gone to our committee meetings and we stamp it, but there's one big strategy discussion at each one of those meetings, and it's on the agenda, and it takes up a meaty amount of time, and you're using the resources of the board and the skill sets of the board to really help solve for key issues for the organization. So think about your agendas, think about how you're staffing your board, think if you're sitting on the board side, saying to your board chair, We want more active discussion and engagement so that we can really talk about ideas and actually use the skills of our board much more effectively. Also rely on judgment of dependable resources. So these could be outside experts. How many of you are actually bringing in outside experts to talk to your board on a regular basis? So I see a handful. Great. And who are they? Example. Yep. Great.
We have a lot of facilities issues. We have messes issues. And so we bring in someone from the local real estate market to help us decide what we're going to do.
Fabulous. Others?
Fundraising expert to teach
Fundraising?
us about all that.
Yeah,
Planning.
good. Good. How about you bringing in your auditors? Should be bringing in your auditors annually to present to your board the audit if you're doing audits. And you should be asking management to step out of the room during that time period or the end of that time period so that the board can ask questions that they may not be comfortable asking in front of staff. So make sure you provide that space. Also, sometimes many of my boards actually at this point in time are also going into executive session as a standing item on the agendas. Now, why would we do that? Why might that be a good idea?
Express their views more thoroughly or honest, candidly,
Yeah.
more candid talk.
Yeah. What else might that inspire?
For the CEOs, the staff of the organization, it
Yeah.
creates a regular opportunity for the board to talk. So every time you don't see an executive session, you're thinking about, am I going to get fired today or something could happen.
It's a very good point. Right. So if you regularize it, if it happens at every single meeting, it's not too long. What we don't want is all these conversations that are sort of offline that aren't part of the conversations with management. But it's an opportunity to check in. It's an opportunity to raise any questions or issues. Sometimes, frankly, those conversations relate to the operating of the board itself. And the board may not want to have that conversation in front of the CEO. So providing that opportunity for discussion, short enough, standing agenda item, often a good idea. Also, you can get some really good strategy conversations out of those sessions. Yes?
Yeah.
So all the staff is asked to leave the room. Yeah, it's board only as part of the executive session. Yeah. So duty of loyalty, obligation to keep confidences of nonprofit and avoid actions that benefit self at expense of nonprofit. Yes.
Can I just follow what Scott started there?
Yes. Great.
Often the CEO is on the board. Are you encouraging an opportunity for the board to meet
Yes.
just for themselves?
Without
You're saying
CEO.
executive session there.
Without CEO. Without any staff of any sort present. Yes. That's right. Yeah. Yeah. So duty of loyalty. So this is obligation to keep confidences, avoid actions that benefit self. So what are we looking for in here? How many of your organizations have formal conflict of interest policies? Okay, good, because we ask that now on the 990. It's a category you have to check. If you don't check it, it's not good, as everybody's looking at your 990s, remember, online. So why are they so important? I have an insurance company. I sit on this board. I've got a really good insurance company. It actually gives really good prices, and the majority of the business that we do is nonprofit business. So we understand the business. We'd give them a really good price. I sit on the board. My nonprofit has decided that they're going to bid out their contract for insurance this year. What do I need to do? I have an answer. I have a really good insurance company. I'll give you a really good price. What's the process? Recuse, yes. So most conflict of interest policies would require me to actually leave the room if I were going to bid at all. Some organizations, literally, as part of their conflict of interest policies, will not allow me to do business at all in any way with that organization if I sit on the board. But if it is possible, okay, I've recused myself, what else do I need to do? You're all the other members of the board. What are you going to make sure happens in that rebidding process? I'm out of the room. You don't have to worry about me anymore. What else? Can we all just vote and say we like Lynn's insurance company? We think it's a really great company. She'll give us a good price? No, go ahead. Yes. Okay, so at least 3 bids on average, sometimes more, even if I want to be part of that bidding process. And again, I need to stay out of any of those discussions at the board level or committee level as the decisions are being made. Yes?
You'd have to have a transparent, formalized process
That's
so
right.
that if anyone goes back and questions, then you have to justify why you went through it in the way you did.
Right. That's right.
Don't you just think that's a bad practice in general?
I was gonna say,
Just
tell
a
the
board
guy
member
what you
doing
did.
business with the entity. I mean, it just is not good.
I want to jump in there because you're right, but think about small rural communities. And you have the leaders from, the chamber or the housing person, and you need that kind of expertise. So there are some circumstances in which you have to get a little more clever about how to handle it.
Yeah, we're also finding with auditing companies, there are A, not a lot of auditing companies anymore to do annual audits, and B, ones that really know the nonprofit sector. It's a whole different way of operating. So we're actually running into some issues of just having enough of the category to be able to do the business that you need. So it can be very tricky. One of the examples I put up with my students is when Carnegie Hall was renovated, the board chair's son was actively involved he had a very nice architectural firm and really thought that he could do the best possible job for Carnegie Hall. And we went through the process of how did they bid it? They did not bid it. Caused all kinds of issues on the back end in terms of their donor population, ability to raise money, monitoring the contracts. So you can imagine the conflicts, obviously. And we're avoiding many more of them these days because the 990 now requires you to check about conflict of interest policies, much more standard practice. Yes?
In-kind contributions. So through the board,
Yeah.
certain expertise. You know what? I can help with this building. In fact, I'll do it as an in-kind
Uh-huh.
contribution.
Yeah.
And the board member being thinking that's what they're doing to help.
Yeah.
Then how do you counsel boards with that?
We actually still counsel a formal process, even if it's free, that they go through the formal process of looking at other providers and that they make a deliberate decision. Often we would say that the board member needs to step off the board, take a leave of absence during that period. So if there is some activity that's going on there that would require board monitoring anyway, we could ask them to step off during that time. And it's just cleaner. You avoid all conflicts of interest. Finally, duty of obedience required.
You have a question
Sorry.
over there? You have
Yes.
a question over there?
Yeah.
I just have a related question.
Yes.
So, in some of our subcommittees, we have people who are not members of the board that might provide expertise
Yep.
and may, in fact, be vendors.
Yes.
What do you think about that?
Yeah, we would often, what I would counsel my clients around is still send them through a process. Yeah, I think it's just safe. It's safe. It's the safest for the organization, and frankly, it's safer for them as involved members with an organization.
Yeah, the primary reason is I think it's like the rumor mill phenomena,
Right.
and
Right.
the game of telephone is one person tells one person
Right.
and what you have then is like it's just almost like this ambiance of like, wow, that's corrupt, and it's just I wouldn't even do it.
Yeah.
Either run a process like you said, or it's like a policy. We don't do that.
Yeah. Yeah.
I was gonna say, we hold our advisory committee members to the same conflict of interest.
That's great.
standard. And they sign the same policy.
Yeah. And very good point. Signing these policies and signing them on an annual basis just reinforces the practice. So we don't get any confusion. It's no embarrassment. It's just the way we do business. It's like putting on the agenda the executive session. So finally, duty of obedience, understanding the mission and bylaws, ensuring regulatory filings are completed, 990s, audited financial statements, require operation audit and policy review. So we spend a lot of time thinking about how we educate our board, the staff. How many of you deliberately think about that as part of every single board meeting? And what are some of the things that you do?
So the last one we just had, we had a fundraising
Uh-huh.
about how we think about going after donors.
Mm-hmm. Uh-huh. Yeah. How else do you educate them about your mission? What are you doing? What are some of the tools in the toolkit for doing that? How many of you are doing executive director reports or have executive director reports? How many of those are if you're serving clients or you're literally bringing in the clients that you serve so that they hear that voice? Many of my museums, as a standing part of their practice, will take their board members down into the conservation studios if they've bought a new piece of work, so you can literally meet a curator, meet a conservator, actually look at the work that's being done out in the galleries, down in the bowels. So really actively thinking about the learning agenda for each one of your board meetings and making sure that you're tying your board members back to mission, really closely teaching them about what you do, giving them the different voices that they should be hearing in your various staff members and the clients that you serve. And literally every single board meeting, I am learning something about that business and I'm learning something about that organization. You know, a lot of times what we hear from our board members is that they just don't learn from their board engagements. You know, they joined a board to learn about the cultural sector. They really wanted to know what was going on in the big museum world, or they really wanted to know more about the music world, and that's why they're sitting on the San Francisco Symphony Board. But they hear nothing about the details of that business, what's going on, how are new audiences changing, what is some of the research around that staff members are all dealing with day to day to day, but we don't show that work to our board. So really being deliberate about how you educate your board is very, very important. So what makes a dynamic board member? Obviously not coming to meetings unprepared. Obviously not attending and rubber stamping, obviously not focusing on minutia and the details and missing the strategy. We need our boards to really be involved with strategy. Focusing on your own private business acquisition, obviously not a good idea, and managing the staff. Okay, let's give you an example. I walk into my nonprofit organization and there is no one at the desk. We still have a front desk in this organization. There's nobody there. I go a little bit deeper into the offices. Nobody there. I'm anxious. Where is everyone? Why aren't they at their jobs? Why aren't they seeing people? Why aren't they around? Why isn't someone there to pay attention to me and others? Okay, so how do I voice that concern effectively? Or do I voice that concern effectively to anyone? Yes?
As a board member, you're not a line manager. You're responsible for strategy and policy and all that stuff. That's what I would do. I'd go to the head and say, hey, you know, I think you got something there. You might want to look into this.
Other options?
I would have said to go to the president or the board chair.
Yep. So usually what we find is the path to the board chair is usually the best one because we have concerns about the day-to-day practices. We have worries. There may be very good reason why nobody is there. Maybe everybody's out in the field. You know, maybe everybody's out doing service to the various groups that they're serving. So it's a little confusing to a CEO. Why would that maybe be confusing that a board member comes to a CEO with those kinds of questions? I'm a CEO. Who's my boss? Right. So maybe a little bit safer and better practice to go through. I could also voice it on the annual survey that hopefully I'm doing, or the HR, if we're doing an evaluation on a regular basis of a board member. I could voice those kinds of concerns. But managing the staff of the organization is the role of the CEO. And if I have concerns about that as a board member, I need to feed that back in productively, and that should be part of an overarching evaluation of a staff person. So, dynamic board members, join for the right reasons, understand their responsibilities, develop a valuable role, define a valuable role, which is usually the strategy role is the most important role here, as well as supporting the financial needs of the organization. They enjoy the people and the mission, they give and they get philanthropic support, work, wealth, and wisdom. So, almost all of my organizations have policies around giving and getting. How about all of yours? How formalized are those policies? Do you all have formalized policies with your organizations? It's in your bylaws. Great. And tell us what's in your bylaws.
Well, we're a relatively small nonprofit, so what's in our bylaws is that each board member is expected to give $500 per year.
Great. Yeah. What are some of the rest of you doing? Yes.
What do you mean by and get philanthropic support?
So some organizations have both a requirement for individual board giving or board-related foundations and companies. So there's an expectation of a dollar amount on an annual basis. Or what I tend to like more is this organization should be one of your top 3 philanthropic interests, because many of my groups want lots of different types of board members on their board. So I may be able to give $10,000, another person may be able to give $100,000, another person may be able to give $500, and we want to value each of those individuals, but we want to be top priority. So we don't want to be competing with more than 2 other organizations for that top philanthropic post. So there are several ways to do the financial obligation of boards. And then the getting is actually getting resources. So working with the development team, working with the CEO to actively solicit gifts on behalf of the organization. Yes? So there are only a few situations, and it's really tightened down the last few years in particular, where we would consider stipends for board service to be appropriate in the nonprofit sector. It's really discouraged. I can think of one example where we have, it's a former client of mine, which is the Autry Museum in Los Angeles. And we need, as part of that board, to have stewardship councils of the various tribes represented. So we have leadership of the tribes coming in to be part of that board, and we pay stipends for travel expenses, not stipends, just over and above, as you would think in the for-profit sector, but stipends to cover travel. That's about as much as you see in this day and age for most organizations. It's really discouraged because it could set up a potential conflict of interest. And also because we need our boards, frankly, to be supporting our organizations financially. So that would be the other, yes.
They don't want to get.
Right.
It's like they'll do anything but ask for money.
Right. Right.
But I think there's a culture of the board that's established by the board president and the ED.
Yep.
And that you need to recruit people.
Yep.
And let them know that that's a big part of their responsibility.
So my group, I would tell my groups, make sure you have a board policy that the board has processed through the development committee, through the executive committee, and has voted on with the full board. Even getting it in your bylaws is even better, but at least you have a board policy. And you're using that policy when you're recruiting, so that people literally are asking and being given the answer to the question, how much will this cost me? What are the financial requirements and obligations? And you cover both the personal giving aspects and to what categories, and then you also cover the getting, the requirements. And giving them the tools and supporting them, actually, which, many of our board, that's a little bit different on the side of actually giving themselves. But on the getting side, yes, giving them the tools to really be effective there and actually quantifying lots of different kinds of involvement there. Not everybody has to solicit. Some people are really good at stewardship and cultivation, lousy at soliciting. Some are really great at soliciting. So that really requires staff to think about the various roles and educate the board and engage them in those various roles. Yeah, in the back.
Give or get. So maybe there's certain board members that just can't give. But they're well connected.
I'm not. I have to say, I come down pretty strongly on this because everybody can do a $10 gift or everybody can do a $25 gift. So it's not so much, it's why I don't like dollar amounts as requirements, because I really like to see variation, and many organizations need to hear many different voices on their board for lots of different reasons. We have clients. In Planned Parenthood, we actually have clients that serve on the board. So, those are going to be, we're going to have different levels of possibility for giving. But if you don't have a financial stake in the organization, you can't be truly committed, and you can't ask others for money, frankly. So, that's right. It's the gesture, and it's saying you're one of my top 3 philanthropic interests, and it gives you, frankly, the power to ask others for funds. So let me just keep moving here. So before you join a board, 4 related topics, and I talk a lot with my students about this. Board service is a lot of work, especially when we are dealing with young MBA graduates that are just sort of getting started in their careers. It's a lot of work, so you really want to think about not only can you make that kind of time in your schedule for board service and do it at the level you need to do it at, and then you really need to pick an organization that you really care about, or else it's just too much work, frankly. It's just, you're not going to find it fulfilling. So we talk a lot about your interest. Where are your passions? What role could you play with the organization? We talk about the expectations. Are you ready to, frankly, think about and work with those expectations around time and role and giving and getting for philanthropy purposes. Think about the quality of the organization, the life stage of the organization. Those engagements are going to be very different. The quality of leadership, and I would stress that probably is number 1, 2, or 3 at this point in time if you're thinking about board service. Make sure that you really believe in the leadership of the organization, and that's both the volunteer side as well as the staff side. The financials are strong, reputation is clear, and the composition, and working arrangements are ones that you can deal with. Do these committees always meet at night? Do you have children and just couldn't do that? Do they always meet during the day? You've got a job that's not that flexible. So think about how the board is getting its work done. We spend a lot of time also talking about the types of boards, and really, 3 big categories that we would give you here that relate to usually the age of the organization. So our organizing boards are usually going to be institutions that are fairly young in their life. Sometimes they're just starting out. They often have the founders still involved with the organization. Hooga, 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 big red flag, make sure you want to work with founders, I allow no more than 1 founder-led organization into my practice at any one time. I mean, love them, fabulous, passionate, wild rides, crazy as anything when they have to transfer from that founding vision to the next stage of life. So I'm often taking organizations from that founding place to the next stage without the founders. But really exciting. I mean, if you want passion, usually those are the most passionate of the boards and board experiences that you would have. So often those guys are also young. They don't have a lot of staff. You're usually in there rolling up your sleeves. You need to do everything from licking stamps or the equivalent this day and age to, actually talking about strategy and policy. So there are different engagements from our governing boards, which usually tend to be more mature organizations. They're larger, they're more diverse. Committee work is more important. You're actually doing a lot of the work of the organization in committee. Shared authority, you usually have professional staff there. And then institutional boards. We have some very big boards, and I'm working with most of my clients have boards that are in the range of 35 to 60. We have to think a lot about how to make the board meetings meaningful when they're that big, because a lot of that work is getting done in the committees. But they tend to be the places where institutions are more mature. They're frankly, less wild rides. They've got processes and procedures in place, professional staff. Your engagement's going to be very different. So as you think about board engagement, think about these different life stages and which would be most fun for you. So 6 pitfalls: checking business knowledge at the door. Those business practices are really important, but understanding the culture of the nonprofit sector is equally as important. If you're going to be sitting on a board, that culture piece is often what those business board members miss, and the culture is really critical. Assuming a business perspective, only way to look at issues, same flavor. Failing to invest the time to get to know the organization, its industry, its history, its programs, finances, and leaders. So again, this is a really shared responsibility. We talk a lot about with the COOs and CEOs about how they're staffing their boards and what those agendas look like. Also forgetting why they wanted you in the first place and why you wanted them. So make sure that you're really aligned from a passion and interest standpoint. Providing ideas nonprofits could never implement. Again, that's really about understanding the culture and where the organization is, and then confusing the role of the director and the role of the volunteer. Often that's where we get in trouble, when board members are in literally doing the work of staff members. Turn back to Nora.
Okay, so I want to bring you back from being a good individual board member and back to the study that came behind the research that went into the frameworks and some of this information about how to be a really dynamic board member. So this was McKinsey and Company did this research. They were asking 3 questions. It was basically about the importance of a governing board, what are the characteristics of a really high-functioning board, and what are the best processes to build a high-functioning board. They looked at a literature review. They interviewed board members and CEOs of the top 100 nonprofits. So we're talking about a large survey here of lots of different people. of the interviews, and then they surveyed the leading U.S. health and human services organizations. So we're talking about hundreds of organizations were looked at for this study. And the report was trying to look at lessons learned. What are the promising practices you should think about? How do you assess your board? How do you actually look at the board functioning? Not just know what you should do, but know how you're doing as you are. So here's the report. It's called the Dynamic Board. If we have a fishbowl over here, if you want a copy of the report, happy to make it available to you. Part of it is available online on the web, but the self-assessment at the back is not always attached. So we have that all for you, so you can take it and run with it yourselves. In closing, there are lots of good resources for board members. You know, Lynn's firm, Martz & Lundy, to do consulting. You mentioned other fundraising consultants. These are some of the large national organizations that have good materials. I would recommend BoardSource, that have local trainings, Compass Point, GuideStar, that you can look up 990s on. Independent sector represents the nonprofit sector. BridgeStar is information about jobs and research. Charity Navigator is for donors who are looking at where they should give money. You want to do real well on Charity Navigator, right? So you need to look at your 990s are speaking for you. In many, the 990 is used for the Charity Navigator and for GuideStar. Okay, so it's important. Don't just let your CFO hand in a 990. This is going to be your public face. And finally, the center here for nonprofit and public leadership. I mentioned that we're here. We want to work more with alumni. Kathy, is there anything you would want to add?
No, other than if I didn't give you one of our pamphlets here,
Okay. And we will be finding out shortly whether we will be offering, starting in the fall, twice a year, starting with twice a year, then going to 3 times a year, executive ed in, this is Christina from Center for Executive Education, in nonprofit boards and on other topics that you might have interest in. So if you want to be on our mailing list to know about that, again, put your card in the fishbowl, and we're happy to let you know. And finally, before I know you want to close, one more thing I want to say. We have a Haas board member. Her name is Carol Meyer. And recently, some of you are smiling. You may know her or the gift or match she just made. So at a Women in Leadership dinner a few weeks ago, she said, "I believe in Haas." Haas was actually founded by a woman, Cora Jane Flood, and I'm going to stand up now and take us to the next level. So she put out up to $500,000 match for any woman, and some of you men are affiliated with women who can make gifts also. Any dollar you give, if you haven't given this year to Haas, is a 2-to-1 match, okay? You can go online, you can write a check, Carol Meyer match. Make sure that goes on there. And if you haven't given to Haas ever, it's a 5-to-1 match. Make a $50 contribution, you figure it out, okay? All right? So just want to let you know that that's kind of great boardsmanship, right? And it's right here at home. So thank you for being attentive. Christine, you want to? Okay.
Thank you, Professor Silver and Heinrich, for this session today. My name is Christina Susak, and I'm the Director of Marketing and Executive Education here at the Haas School of Business. We just became a 501c3 April 1st, and that's not a joke. We provide 20% of the operating revenue for the Haas School of Business, and our goals are doubling and tripling every year. We plan to become a $50 million organization within 3 years. So what we do at the Center for Executive Education is we have a portfolio of about 18 different short 2 to 5 day programs that iterate throughout the year. Everything from strategy to negotiations to product management. We've worked with Professor Silver. We plan to do more on nonprofit boards and nonprofit leadership. So we have a booth, so please stop by at the Bank of America Forum and you can pick up some of our brochures. And thank you for your participation today.
And enjoy the rest of the day.
Yes,
folks.
thank you.
my slides on? They may be loaded up here. Okay, check it out. If not, I have my laptop. Do you know what the name of it was, or? That looks like you? Yeah. Okay. Load it up, man. Cool. Let's see what I. Check. I just want to look at the full set. Full set? Yeah.
Wrap that around you if you want.
Okay.
You gonna wait a little bit, or you gonna go?
I think maybe a few more minutes. Okay, great. Should I wait a few more minutes, or? Where'd they have lunch?
Oh, sorry?
Did you guys serve?
UC Berkeley, and he also, as I mentioned, works a lot with us at the Center for Executive Education. He is the founding director of the Greater Good Science Center, where they study happiness and the meaning of life. And his research is actually, he does a lot of research on emotions, some of the great emotions like love and awe and beauty. Beauty is an emotion, but a lot of his research is based on that, and then also about the research of power and status. And Dacker, he has created a podcast based on your course on emotion that they were rated in the top 5 of educational downloads. And also by the, how do you pronounce it, Udney Reader. He is considered one of the 50 most inspiring people. So with that, I'd like to introduce Dr. Feldman.
Well, thanks for coming back to Cal or Berkeley and for returning to your place of education, and thanks for being here on this glorious day, and hope to have a nice hour and 15 minutes. So today is really sort of a snapshot of what I've been working on in my lab and then teaching in the Haas program for the past 15, 20 years, doing this science for 25 years. And what I'd really like to sort of talk about is, one, I've done this long line of work on the positive emotions and how they help us with stress and anxiety and help boost positive indicators of health and the like. And thankfully, I think for many different reasons, the organizational climate and culture is more interested in the emotional lives of workers. And we can thank people like Malcolm Gladwell and David Brooks for that interest. And then the second thing that I'd really like to drill down on just a bit is my work on power and hierarchies and status and leadership and the like. And one of the things that I'm going to talk about, and I think that there's an emerging theme as we think about what does it mean to manage and to lead and to build strong teams, is that a lot of the really tough work is, the tough work of leadership is emotional, right? It is, one of my favorite stories in that spirit is the great story of Shackleton, who went down to the South Pole, tried to make it there with this incredible boat of individuals, got stuck in the ice, was risking life, and his crew of 23 at every moment in the time. And what you find is that his ability to get them back to safety and to navigate, 800 miles in really frozen seas, it wasn't really kind of this based in effective decision making. It was really based in building strong team. And what we now know is that 54% of Americans work in team-like environments. It's just one of the big shifts in the nature of work and how we're productive. We also know from really, really interesting papers of late that teams are more productive and analytically rigorous if they do the hard emotional work of building camaraderie and listening to each other and encouraging the best opinions of those around you. And so today is really this nice confluence of, how do we bring the positive emotions into the workplace and why? And then how does that make for more effective leadership? And I hope to really round that out. So today what I'll talk about is a little snapshot on the study of human happiness. We'll talk about very briefly about some of the things I've learned about power and hierarchy and leadership. And then we'll talk about some of the more ethical ways in which we can take this science and lead in ways that build greater trust, that build greater empathy, that empower team members, that really give meaning during stressful times. So what I'd like to talk about is, first of all, is, you guys are looking at me. I teach a lot of really skeptical audiences who are, MDs and lawyers and, people in sort of financial advising firms, and they're looking at me like, why am I listening to this Berkeley guy talk about happiness and stress, man? He sits in a hot tub and gets to do this stuff. I'm doing the real hard work of organizational life. And I share that skepticism, but I hope, and I know you guys have been tracking this, that there is this incredible science on the importance of handling stress and finding meaning and happiness that says
It's not a luxury or a privilege. That happiness and the meaning of your own life at work and that of other people around you is one of the most important things you can do for the bottom line. So this is just to sort of give you a flavor of why should you be worried about the sort of cultivating well-being and beauty and love, as Julie talked about, in the face of stress. There are now over 250 studies of human happiness. And the first point that I'd just like you guys to think about is that what we've learned is that the health of your family and your workers very much is tied to their well-being and their happiness. It's a classic mind-body finding. So what we're finding, for example, famous study, if you look at nuns as they enter into the convent, they wrote these essays decades ago about who they are as a person. And if you find the happier nuns, they are much more likely to live into the 80s and 90s than the less happy nuns, right? Happiness is boosting longevity. If you look at across studies, what we find is that happiness for the average human being adds about 7.5 years to your life expectancy, right? Now, you know, smoking costs you 9-10 years, right? And I know some of you are like, well, if I'm happy when I smoke, do I get an extra 1.5 years to life expectancy? I can't answer that question. But when you just stack that up and you think about it, 7.5 years of life expectancy, that compares to the biggest determinants of how long you live, like your diet and your moderate exercise you're supposed to be getting, avoiding hard alcohol. It's as big a predictor of physical robustness as you can find in the epidemiological landscape. So it is really important. Second point, and you know, I'm just sort of setting the stage for where we're going to go, which is that happiness is good for productivity, right? You know, we have this stereotype of the really creative genius, the Vincent van Gogh, the Charles Darwin, the Virginia Woolf, the geniuses, the Steve Jobs, and we kind of stereotype them as being full of angst and anxiety and anger. Steve Jobs, it may be true, you know, and just in this turmoil. But it turns out that stereotype is dead wrong. That there are now hundreds of studies that find that if I'm part of a team and we're feeling connected and having some fun, if I'm in a lab study and you give me the hardest math problems or logical problems or scientific problems to solve, and I'm feeling more happy, I'm actually more rigorous in my thought and the quality of my work, right? So happiness isn't some sort of luxury or sort of the icing on the cake, if you will. In our work, it actually, as this graph shows, makes better work on teams, more creative work. Negotiators who are put into happy states do better in negotiations for both sides. One of my favorite demonstrations found if you give one of the best ways to make people happy is to give people chocolate, because chocolate triggers this sort of chemical reaction I'm about to tell you about that makes you more connected to fellow human beings. So a researcher actually gave medical doctors little bags of chocolate, and they were more effective at diagnosing disease, right? That's my solution to the health crisis, you know, just hand out little bags of chocolate. But this is all to say, when I started teaching this stuff 15, 20 years ago, people look at me like, you know, happiness isn't that important, or why would we care about the emotional lives of work people? And I think this new rigorous science says it's essential for the health and well-being of our cultures. And then finally, you know, just thinking about why we should care about sort of handling stress and cultivating well-being. A lot of the great philosophers have been very interested in, well, that's what politics should give people, is the right to pursue happiness. That's what economics should really be about, right, is creating economic systems where citizens are engaging in their kind of work that is good for the self and others. I'm just going to take a quick tour to sort of give you a feel for this literature. I know you've heard about these findings. The New York Times gobbles them up. Time magazine had covers on this. You know, what makes us happy? Does money make you happy? No. The correlation between wealth and income is 0.1, and that's pretty small. Recent studies suggest, I really hope you think about this, right? but this isn't an argument to underpay the people you're managing, but that after $75,000 a year, money doesn't buy you happiness. It's unrelated to how happy and calm and how much meaning you find in life. It matters a lot in poor nations. It matters a lot if you're living in poverty. That $10,000 extra to your salary means a lot of significant things. But the data are pretty unequivocal that money doesn't matter. When I teach my human happiness class, what we've seen is undergrads think that money really matters a lot in determining their happiness, but they're actually incorrect. This is just saying that. And there are a lot of things that we do for money. This is just a whole wealth of studies. And if you email me, I'll send you some of these slides. In the US, it correlates about 0.12. 37% of the Forbes wealthiest people, one study found, were less happy than the average American. These are people with hundreds of millions of dollars, less happy than the average person on the streets of America. Money does not matter. How about age? I'm just testing your intuitions. You get happier as you get older. Does age matter in terms of your happiness? Excuse me? There's a little dip. That is a little bit of the midlife crisis. But it's not as big as you might imagine, right? Our stereotypes hold that, wow, I go to college and I'm super happy. This is how many people say they're pretty happy, right? What percentage? Teen years, then I'm in my young 20s, I'm living in a city and dating crazily and dancing at discos and whatever. You do have a tiny bit of a dip in the middle of life, but it isn't as strong as we might expect. One of the big things that we discover in the happiness literature, as one of you anticipated, is your happiness in your romantic life follows a slightly different pattern, which is that, anybody know the happiest moment in a marriage? I kid you not. It's actually the week before you get married. And what happens, and then once you have children, it's rather regrettable. Once you have children, the happiness graph kind of goes, and then your kids are teenagers and you're at your nadir, your lowest point. And then your happiness in your marriage starts to rise right about here. Why is that? Because your kids leave and you sort of make the mojito for your partner and you start talking to each other again and it rises dramatically. But age doesn't have as big enough effect on well-being. These are just some funny findings of how the country of origin, where you live, influences your happiness. What we discover, the highly social countries are happier, right? Countries that spend a lot of time connecting to others, in community, face-to-face interactions, as is the case with Mexico. And then the countries with strong sort of social states, like the Netherlands and Switzerland and Denmark, tend to be happiest. Most of the time, the big winner in the happiness sweepstakes as far as cultures goes is Holland, I kid you not. And there are parts of Amsterdam that people identify as the happiest place in the world. We won't speculate about that. But these are just some findings. And then, countries with serious political problems take a dive in terms of happiness. And then the big story, and this is going to be kind of a theme as we move through cultivating sort of happier teams or emotionally intelligent teams, is most of your happiness really resides in the strength of your ties to other people, right? And I actually think that for very interesting evolutionary reasons, a lot of the neurochemistry of happiness is about social relationships, having strong groups, having good friendships, partnerships, connections to your children activates a lot of the neurophysiology of what makes us happy. It's pretty straightforward. So there are just huge effects on your well-being and finding meaning during stress in terms of friendships, marriage effects, having strong social networks. It's one of the great predictors of happiness. And then to the extent someone in your team or in your organization feels lonely or isolated, it is very bad news for health and happiness. And that'll be sort of a subtext as we move through some of the specific things we can do to build strong teams. And then finally, this just shows you get these big boosts. Any kind of partnership, you get this rise in happiness. in our literature. Okay, any questions? I know I'm just kind of setting the stage for this, but any questions on happiness?
On the last slide, it looks like women are happier than men.
Yeah, they get a little bit of a boost in this study. For the most part, you find that there are really no gender differences between women and men in how happy they are. There are many other kinds of emotional gender differences that you should take to your psychoanalyst couch and struggle with them. No, I'm kidding. But for the most part, you don't get gender differences. Nor do you get big age differences, which I find striking. Happiness kind of tends to rise in that 50 to 75 period a little bit and then taper off a bit. Yeah?
Children under happiness? You didn't touch that. So what does the literature say about that?
Well, what we do know is your marriage takes a big bite or takes a dive, which is regrettable. And that replicates in no matter how you study it.
Permanently?
I would say permanently, and your brain never recovers from. But there are things that sort of you can look forward to as a result of having children. Yeah.
Excited about aging and too much happy.
Yeah.
How do you get excited about?
Well, part of it is the happiness literature itself, which is there are really neat studies showing that when you go from, say, my age 50 to 75, even though you lose a little bit of sharpness in your memory, right, which is pretty well documented, and you can't hit the jump shot like you used to be able to, you develop this really interesting social wisdom where you're savvier in reading people, you're less reactive emotionally to when you're engaging in frustrations with other people because your physiology just sort of quiets down a bit. And you actually get this big surge of these wonderful emotions like gratitude and connectedness. So you do get this really neat shift in your profile. That should make you excited about getting older. All right, there we go. So, were you looking for something else? So, other thoughts on happiness? Yeah.
Happiness, your perspective, internal, external. A lot of people see that as that's kind of the common paradigm, right? Is when somebody might say, okay, true happiness derived within, and then other people might say, well, hold on a second, there's a lot of things that we can't control that impact your happiness. Is there a certain percentage breakdown? Would you say, is that even the right way of looking at it?
That's a very serious way of looking at it, and I like it. So what I tell people, and it's actually in part of the question, what we've learned from studies of genetics and the like is that about half of your happiness is your genetic makeup. And there are dopamine circuits in your brain and oxytocin networks I'll talk about briefly that say a lot about how happy you are, and those are shaped by the genetic profile you get from your parents. But about 40% of your happiness is choice and habit. And that's the kind of the stuff you're talking about how do I train my mind to become a little bit more optimistic or to be more grateful, which I'll talk about in just a few minutes. How do I build an environment, right, that we're finding in our research that, just adding a little natural beauty to an environment makes you calmer, makes you more generous, makes you more creative. So just things that you have control over, about 40% of the equation. That's pretty impressive, right? It's a big story in life. Yes?
I saw this Netflix show called Happy. It's called Happy. It's a documentary, and they gave the very same statistic. I just saw it yesterday.
Yeah, and that comes out of all this work on identical twins, who resemble each other twice as much as fraternal twins. So that starts to tell you part of our story is the genes, but a big part is what we do with it. Yeah. Yeah. It's all subjective, which frustrates me. But what I hope this little 15, 20-minute summary says, and for those of you who've raised teenagers or kids, you just know this to be true, which is like, if someone tells you, like, I'm not as happy as I had hoped I would be in this job, you get this you have a very deep understanding of, wow, they're stressed out, they're going to be cost to their body, it's compromising their intellectual performance. So even though it's subjective, it's a very powerful clue to how they're doing in their environment. And I think a lot of people are starting to make the case. It's a very important statement about the health of a community or a culture. Yeah?
Commented that happiness in a marriage hits its nadir when you're raising teenagers.
Yes.
Why is it that stressful times sometimes pull two people apart, and other times, stressful times, pull two people together?
Yeah, that's a terrific question. What I'm going to try to make the case, it's actually a great segue to where we're heading, which is that, you know, we have one thing that stress does is it, as you'll soon learn in a few minutes, is it revs up fight or flight physiology, right? Which I'll talk about, which is no good for relationships, and it'll cost you. It's no good for work relationships or marriages. But then the human mind is super resilient, and we have all these strategies of getting perspective on things, finding play, building up a sense of narrative and keeping your stresses in perspective that actually adds richness to your marriage if you take on those strategies. See where you land at 3 o'clock, because that'll be kind of the last part of the talk. All right, so glad you guys are thinking about happiness. So let me just give you, I suspect all of you are in positions of leading teams and managing, and I hope part of that sense of leadership comes with the notion that you have this privilege of influencing the well-being of the people whom you manage. And that's why this literature I'm about to convey to you on power is all the more important, is that when we have power, when we are in positions of leadership, people's well-being really depends on us. And a lot of the happiness data that I've talked about are at play at work when we lead. Regrettably, what I have documented in really 20 years of science, I'm now working on a book on this, is that and this I suspect is going to sound very familiar to you and intuitive, but what we've found is something that I call the power paradox, which is that as we rise in the ranks, we are one of the critical determinants of rising in the ranks in any kind of hierarchy is your ability to build strong teams, to build up strong relationships, to be empathetic and socially intelligent, right? There are now over 80 studies of people in high-powered organizational settings like finance, Goldman Sachs and the like, in school settings, and in military settings. And what they find is people who gain power have this great social intelligence. They're good students of human nature. They're attentive to what other people are thinking about. They build strong teams. You guys can think, I'm sure, of examples from your own life. Here's the trouble. Once you've used your head and you're sort of socially intelligent and you get your position of power, what we find is that the experience of power, the lofty perch of power, actually knocks out your abilities to be socially intelligent, right? It's as if, and I've studied people who've had brain trauma. When you knock out the brain, this part of your brain, the frontal parts of your frontal lobes, you fall in a motorcycle accident or football or whatever, it kind of, once you lose those regions of your frontal lobes, you kind of start acting like your typical sociopath, right? You sort of steal things and you have sexual affairs and you swear at people and you stop caring about what others feel. And I literally have felt like this people I've studied in my research on who have power act like these impulsive sociopaths, right? They just start acting out in ways that harm their well-being and those around them. Who's your favorite example of somebody who's abused power in such fashion? Bill Clinton, my God, had this legacy that he was heading towards. And who else? Larry Ellison. How so?
Monstrosities that he tries to build, and buying up companies and firing people and buying competitors without any concern what happens to the people.
Yeah. Other example.
Tiger Woods.
Tiger Woods is one of my favorites, right? Just icon of self-discipline, wore that Nike swoosh soap, and then lo and behold, not exactly the person we thought he was. You know, in fact, it's been kind of a banner year when you think about this thesis of power making us kind of crazy and impulsive. We had Arnold Schwarzenegger, of course, who sired a child with his housekeeper. We had Tiger Woods. We had Lance Armstrong. That was spectacular. We had, a rather sadly named senator named Weiner who was text messaging and sending sexes. I mean, it just, yeah.
And I'm not coming up with a woman.
Ask people who live in England about Maggie Thatcher. They'll tell you stories.
Yeah, but it's not as clear cut as Tiger Woods.
I think
not so much of a scandal.
Yeah. Yeah.
Public scandal in such a poignant,
Is there any
powerful.
data on power?
Yes. Well, in our research, we find the same effects. Let me tell you what the effects are. History will, as women rise in power, we'll see if Sheryl Sandberg does the same kind of stuff. And I predict that we'll see a similar pattern of abuses of power.
It seems like all the examples you quoted, people might have always been like, oh, it's not power that made them do that.
Yeah. Well, but that's why we lean on the empirical science, because here's what we find. And let me just tell you what the scientific studies are that don't deal with those kind of confounds. Here, it is a scientific story that complements these kind of historical examples. If we give any human being, male or female, just a little bit of power, and there are various ways you can do this in experiments. You can put them into a position of leadership. You can have them think about a time they had power, right? You can have them control resources. Lots of, even just getting people to read words related to power, like leadership and CEO and authority, right, triggers this part of your brain that makes you go after things that are desirable, what I call the approach system. And what happens is once you have power, all kinds of impulsive behaviors become more likely, right? And we start to look like the Larry Ellisons and the Steve Jobs. This is just a small sampling of what we find. You give a person power, they're more likely to flirt inappropriately, touch people inappropriately, gamble away people's resources, take resources that are part of the common good and take them for yourself. You're more likely to engage in risky behaviors of all manner, be irrationally generous. Here's one of my favorite real-world studies. Christine Porath at USC is really interested in rude, uncivil behavior in the workplace, right? Swearing at people, leaving trash and expecting somebody else to clean it up, telling somebody their PowerPoint looks like crap, right? Swearing at them. Guess where those rude behaviors come from in an organization? At the top. 3 out of 4 of the really, like when I read what people do, the just incredibly rude, uncivil behaviors come from high-level management. Christine has gone on to do this elegant work showing if I'm on a work team and I see somebody else act really rudely, right, it upsets me and I become less creative, I'm less committed to the project, I'm more likely to leave the team, right? It interferes with creativity. Let me just show you one other finding. This was our research on sort of the abuses of power and what it does to us. I was interested in, do powerful people just do the most simple of things in an impulsive way? And so here's what we did. We had 3 people working in our lab, and one of the persons we gave power to. They were either all women groups or all men groups. And we pointed to the person who said, you're in charge, you're going to sort of assign how much people get paid at the end of the study, and off they went. They worked for an hour. And by design, the task was really boring, right? They're writing up some policies for the university, senior testing, campus drinking. They're gathering all these facts. Halfway into the study, in this little room, we bring in this plate of 5 delicious-smelling chocolate chip cookies. Why 5? We knew everyone would take one. We discovered that people always leave one piece of food on a plate. They would only be able to take that last piece of food. So we got to ask the question, who is going to take that 4th cookie, right? It's very sophisticated science. And so what we find indeed, high-power people, both women and men, are more likely to reach out and say, that cookie's mine, buddy, back off. And they take the extra cookie. My grad student, we videotape everything in my lab, and he came to me and he said, I just have this gut feeling people are eating differently depending on their power. So we spent a month coding the videotapes, and what we found is high-power people were more likely to be eating with their mouths open, crumbs falling out of their mouths, saliva gathering at their lip corners, and so, blah, 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 so, that's how basic, and you can't find a study that doesn't kind of converge on the same thing. When I have power, I just kind of start acting in this self-interested, impulsive fashion. Yeah? Yeah. So there are a couple. Let me see if I've got one other. Oh, okay. So let me get to it in just 1 second because it'll be relevant to these final set of. Finally, not only does power. Actually, there's a bigger summary we can. Not only does power make us a little bit more impulsive and do risky things, do things that may be perceived to be rude, and not sort of diminish the quality of the team. But we're also finding that you lose your social edge when you feel powerful, right? You just don't quite as thoughtfully and mindfully attend to other people. Hear the great idea they may have at a team meeting, right? And you don't take in this very valuable social information that is so important to the work we do today. These are just some studies of this, that when I have more power, I'm less able to read people's emotions effectively. So this is just a study of people who have power, and you find high power, low power women and men are better judges of somebody else's emotion. High power people are more likely to stereotype other people, which turns out to be really costly in the workplace setting. Kind of stereotype people according to their gender, their ethnicity, or what have you. Pretty reliably documented effect. By the way, when I'm stereotyped by somebody else, I am not as creative or productive. High power people are not as able to take other people's perspectives, right, and flip out of their own perspective to take another view on a problem. This is a classic study by Joe McGee and Adam Galinsky. Really simple task. I sit in front of somebody and I draw an E on my forehead so that the person across from me can read it really effectively. So what do I have to do? Flip it, right? I can't draw it how I'd like to draw it because it'll be reversed. I have to take that person's perspective and flip out of my own. Low power people do it right away, right? 90% of the time. Oh, okay, I'll take your perspective. High power people, fully 45% of them could not do it during the experimental task. They're like, oops, sorry, I did it wrong. Let me try one more time. And they draw, oh, God. They can't flip out of their own perspective. That's just a basic cognitive ability that's good for just about anything you're doing is just flip out of your perspective. This is another demonstration of the losing our social edge in power. We did this study. We had two people talk to each other about something that caused suffering, right? One person was more powerful than the other. And what we code for, this is the speaker's, how serious is the suffering and stress they're talking about? Is it kind of minor, or is it really serious? And then we had the person on videotape, and we coded like, how much connection are they showing? Are they nodding their head, sort of vocalizing, like, oh, right? Sort of showing encouragement for the person. Here's what we find. For the low-power listener, as they're listening to the speaker talk about more serious stuff, they look like a healthy, civil human being. As it gets more serious, they show more compassion. Like, wow, I'm really sorry that happened. They're nodding their head. High-power person, psychopath. If the person's not talking about very serious stuff, they're totally connected. Hey, maybe this person will go out with me, right? As the conversation gets more and more serious, right? Right about here, the person's saying, then I discovered my mom had cancer, and she had 7 days to live. And the high-power listener, right about here is like, Did you say that was your mom or your dog? I missed that. I'm sorry, right? They're totally disconnecting from this person, so they're showing less compassion. Really serious news. Now, before we head into how do we handle this paradox and create greater happiness in the workplace and in your lives, let me just round out the story, and then we'll get to your question about some neuroscience, which is there are a lot of really cool studies in business schools that are showing, high-power leaders or managers who lead in this less socially intelligent fashion, blurting things out, coercing, sort of dominating team meetings, being overly assertive, stress out their team members, right? Literally at the physiological level. And what they create is this sense of threat and stress. And you guys know the literature on stress, but there are no ambiguities here, which is the single biggest determinant of your feeling of stress or somebody you're working with is feeling disempowered. There are now 205 studies that have looked at stress. And it turns out when I'm revved up with stress and I can't stop thinking about things and my veins feel like they're crackling and my heart, you can just feel your blood pressure going up, the clearest predictor of stress is not danger per se, it's feeling low rank. It's feeling disempowered, right? And what we know is that state, you end up looking like this poor fellow in the office, makes you feel fearful, vulnerable. There's no study that ever finds stress makes you more creative or more analytic and rigorous. It costs you in terms of your intellectual output and creativity. And then what happens, you guys have heard of cortisol? Stress hormone. It's good if you're on an African safari and a rhino is chasing you. You want to have a lot of cortisol because that'll be your best bet to escaping, right? It's not so good if you're at work working on a team project because of lots of reasons. But what we find, if I'm on a team and a leader is not giving me voice and a sense of connection and power, old regions of your brain, the hypothalamus and the amygdala, which is down in there, communicate with the pituitary gland. It sends out a releasing factor to your adrenal glands, and cortisol goes through your bloodstream to all of your organs for fight or flight response. But what we know is when it's chronically there and active, right, you have this really problematic health profile. Depression, anxiety, birth weight issues with your children, increased incidence of cardiovascular problems, respiratory problems, basic physical pain, diabetes, all rise as your sense of power drops. So really just important to keep in mind as we think about leading in ways that are less stressful and more connected and the like, which will be the last part of our time together. Yeah?
But I'm wondering, what's the antidote to break that cycle of getting more power and getting this impulsive sociopath behavior?
That's my last half hour. So see if you're satisfied in the next half hour. So great. And I'll have a really interesting neurophysiological answer to that. Yes?
What's your comment on
that's a deep intuition. The intuition is like, hold on a second. This guy just told me that when I don't have power, I feel stressed. But we all feel in our lives when we're in positions of power and you're running, in my lab, I have 22 people and run this center with 15 people, and I feel stressed about that. But the general pattern in data is the more leadership and power you have, the less stressed you are. My former student, Jen Lerner at Harvard, just published a phenomenal study where she measured cortisol, and she teaches government leaders, military leaders, executives at the Kennedy School at Harvard, and found the higher you rise in any organization, the less cortisol you have. So it feels like demands, but the demands have a different emotional quality to them when we feel we have power. Yeah. Did you have a question or comment?
Same question. I question
because
Yeah.
and I'm a CEO, and
Yeah.
and I play counselor to 3 managers a day who have need reassurance, need encouragement, wondering about their careers, and it lands in your office all the time.
It is.
And
It does.
I think that level of stress is reflects out into the things I do then.
Yeah. But I suspect and I bet you have a lot of good days. On the good days, and as to one of your questions, like there are antidotes to stress, which we're going to get to for our last 25 minutes, that you're bringing into the workplace. And there are good reasons. There are lots of new studies showing the CEOs and managers who take on a little bit of that work, feels costly in the moment, the team does a lot better, right? It's just part of the complexities of management. Yeah?
My question was, I think it's great to know. There's the level where you are here and then the level where you want to be.
Yeah.
And getting there is stressful. So they go through a certain level of risk-taking, gambling. Or
Yeah.
I mean, it takes certain things to put yourself out there and get there.
Yeah.
That to me is stressful. And the question is, how do you balance it, or you just go for it? I mean, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
On sort of the strategies that allow you to rise. Yeah, and I think that you're onto something, which is it's going to be a mixture of this social savviness that we've talked about and really building networks and attending to people strongly. The strategic, risky proposition will help as well. So maybe we can take it up a bit after, too. Yeah?
So a question about the behavior as they get to a position of power and somebody starts exhibiting this behavior.
Yeah.
Is it consistent with the audience? Like if they weren't doing this to get to the position of power, are they doing this with other people who are empowered to them? Or are they only doing it to people that are peers or below them? And then how does that perception impact their ability to retain leadership, or do they lose leadership as a result of the behaviors?
Yeah. Wow. I mean, you're way ahead of the science. So this kind of impulsivity, loss of social intelligence, once you have power, does it just cut across contexts with all kinds of relationships? And we just don't know. There's a little bit of data that suggests it's mainly with people you're leading, and you're a little bit more thoughtful when you're dealing with people at the same level in an organization. But no one's really explored it.
So the other thought that I was curious about too is, do people who exhibit this behavior as a result of having power and then they start doing this impulsivity, do people respond to it as, okay, they're in a position of power, or do they respond to it as, if somebody else isn't in a position of power but is doing these things, do we respond as maybe they have power and I didn't realize it?
Yeah, yeah. Well, there's a bit of that latter thesis that there are select studies showing if I act impulsively, if I show this enraged outburst, if I sort of bang around too much, that people will think I have some power and give me a little bit of power. So there is a strategic side to this. All right. So let me give you a little bit of neuroscience and then talk about what we can do to get from here to there and then to deal with the tough stuff of high-level management, which is, I think, increasingly part of our work life for various reasons. So what I have done, well, let me, I don't know how oh my God, I have all these strange slides. So what I can tell you is, so I'll answer the first question and then we'll talk about this, the reasons why there are really sound practices to handle the stress that are neurophysiologically based. What we know with respect to power, impulsivity really comes out of what's called the dopaminergic system. It's down in the middle of your brain in a couple of pieces called the nucleus accumbens and the ventral tegmental. It's right down on top of your spinal cord, the base of your spinal cord. And dopamine is really about going and getting things that you like, right? Gambling for things, sort of pursuing food and sex and esteem and aggressive behavior. It just gets the body to move forward and do things. And there are select studies showing power really turns that system on so that you're just more impulsive, right? A second fascinating finding that connects to what we've talked about, since you asked about neuroscience, is Naomi Eisenberger showing when I'm in a position, if I show you a picture of somebody crying, it activates this part of your frontal lobe that helps us read other people's emotions. They call it an empathy network, right? If I have a lot of power, the person crying does not activate that part of your frontal lobe that helps you read other people's emotions. So there's select studies on the neuroscience. All right, so this I want to ground you guys in. I could spend several hours talking about this, but it'll help us kind of return to the early themes on happiness and then go forward about thinking about handling stress and leading in a socially intelligent fashion. What recent neuroscience has discovered is we are a hyper-social, connecting, I would even venture to say, cooperative species. We can debate that if you like, but really incredible new data on that thesis. There are several reasons why we're a super social, highly cooperative, Charles Darwin thought sympathetic, compassionate species. The most pronounced reason why, it has to do with these pictures that I'm showing you. These are our primate relatives who share 99% of our DNA. That's the bonobo. Have you guys heard of the bonobo? It's the smaller chimpanzee. It's matrilineal. It has sex all the time and uses sex for everything. If they get into fights, they have sex, and then they resolve their conflicts, you know. And most people, when they read about the bonobo, they're like, you know, I think I'd rather be that species than what I am. But anyway, you know. Then there's a chimpanzee. And these are little baby bonobos and chimpanzees. And they're doing things that are unusual compared to human babies, which are taking care of themselves, right? They're sitting by themselves. They're sitting up. They're feeding themselves. Human babies take years to learn how to feed themselves. They don't navigate space very effectively until 1 or 2 years of life. Current estimates are that these guys reach independence really early. Our babies take from 7 to 49 years to reach the age of independence. And, you know, economy's getting a little better, so, you know, kids won't be living in your basement as long, so that maybe it'll be earlier. But that's a good estimate. But that, you know, this is an important thesis in the science that I do. That just changed everything about our social structures. We just had to be collaborative and cooperative just to get the carriers of our genes, our babies, to the age of viability, and a lot of other things happening. We became this super social connecting species. And this is what is really the neuroscience that you guys should keep in mind once we start talking about how to handle stress in our last 25 minutes. What we're starting to discover is there is part of our brain and part of our peripheral nervous system that helps us cooperate, build teams, connect, and take care of. We call it the prosocial nervous system. And what I will tell you is there are tons of new data suggesting, first of all, the system I'm about to describe to you, the more that it's activated, the less stress. You can't feel stress because it shuts down the cortisol stress system. That is interesting. So the more I feel grateful, it's almost physically impossible to feel stress, right? The more you sort of talk through the struggles of somebody you're managing and they calm down, it's physically impossible to be stressed. Of course, you're feeling stressed, but we'll talk about that. Now, this is the system. If I show somebody images of suffering in my lab, of inspiring individuals, of social connection, like families reuniting, what happens? It's really quite remarkable. Old parts of your brain light up, like the periaqueductal gray and parts of your frontal lobes. That part of your brain triggers the release of this little miracle called oxytocin. It's produced in the hypothalamus, and it goes down your brainstem into your organs, and then it goes up into your brain. You guys heard of oxytocin? It's incredible, right? It helps women with milk letdown, uterine contractions. When the mom looks at the baby that's just been born and it's covered in fluids and it looks like it's been in a boxing match, she's like, that's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. That's oxytocin tricking her. Like, just, you know. There are new studies showing if I get a nice pat on the back, I get oxytocin release. One study found if you catch couples kissing each other, they get oxytocin relief. This is a study, just to show you how powerful this is in creating team. If this is a study in which I give a participant $20 and they get to give away money to a stranger, and before they give the money to the stranger, they either whiff a little saline solution or they take a whiff of oxytocin, right? And what you find is that 50% of people who have had a little whiff of oxytocin give away all their money, right? Here you go, man. You're my brother. Hey, Grateful Dead, whatever it is. So look at. I mean, that's absolutely stunning levels of generosity. Thankfully, the British, and by the way, a lot of the happiness studies. I hope no one's English in here. Anybody? Yeah. They always are ranked the lowest of industrialized nations in terms of happiness. But the British have developed a spray of oxytocin that you can fill rooms full of oxytocin spray. So if you're fundraising or you got a tough meeting, come on in. We're going to have a tough negotiation. Yeah. So I kid you not. Now here it gets even more interesting, and Julie's heard me just rave on about this, but this is an incredible bundle of nerves called the vagus nerve. Have you guys heard about the vagus nerve? It's kind of a mystery in science. Medical doctors kind of have vague ideas about it, but what we're starting to learn, this is unique to mammals, it's in yellow here, and the vagus nerve, there are a lot of data that suggests it really is about team and connection, right? So it is activated by oxytocin, it goes to your throat, helps you vocalize, helps you make eye contact with people, move muscles to move your head. This is really important, you guys. It drops down into your lungs and your heart, and the vagus nerve slows your heart rate down. So it helps you have a very healthy cardiovascular profile. It then goes on and influences digestive processes. It also communicates with your immune system. So what's incredible, all of the states and the practices that I'm about to talk about to handle that stressful colleague, right? Gratitude, telling stories, playing a little, goofing around a bit, all of them activate this pro-social physiology and your vagus nerve. So it's this clear pathway towards health and wellness. Questions? I know I'm blazing through a lot of new terms in neuroscience, but this really grounds some of the stuff we're about to head into. Questions or observations? So here's what I take from that. And it was this really interesting observation that one of you anticipated as antidotes, which is you've got this stress profile. We can readily fall into that. Then you've got this social connection profile. And what we know is anything that turns on this physiology is going to shut down your stress response and be very good news for health, creativity, and a lot of the, and happiness, any of the indices that we're interested in. All right, so as Julie said, I teach classes on emotion and human happiness. I have a book, Born to Be Good, that kind of talks about this stuff. And I'm just going to pull out a few highlights for you guys that are, in my teaching, the most relevant to the complexities of organizational life. But if you step back and look at it, and this science of happiness that we began with, what we see is there's one set of practices and habits of the mind that makes you stressed out and have a high cortisol profile, right, that we've documented. And it's things like feeling isolated, distrusting people, being aggressive, blaming others, feeling pessimistic. One of you mentioned kind of the optimistic mindset about aging. Feeling or rejecting people. Instead of telling a story, sort of shutting down conversation about hard stuff, which is part of work life. Feeling like there's no purpose or meaning to what you're doing. And then what we now know, and I'll give you a few highlights, is that this stuff is the real stuff of healthy leadership that builds strong teams, that gives you this entirely different physiological profile. It's social connection, building a trusting environment, generosity. I'm going to put in gratitude here, feeling grateful, talk about that for a second. And then I'm going to talk about the power of stories, just what you were describing very nicely earlier, which is like part of work life is telling stories about personal things or the story of the organization or the story of the progression of your work. It's just, and it turns out to be a great antidote to stress, as I'll show you. So this is, if we had I usually take about 4 hours to teach this stuff to executives, so I apologize. I just wanted to give you kind of a full array of what's in this space. All right, so let me, in the spirit of our last 14 minutes, I'll kind of prioritize some of the biggest hits in this literature on stress and happiness and healthy organizational life. The first is just, doing the hard work of making your members of your team feel connected, right? Because we know the strongest determinant of longevity and happiness is social connection. The studies are stunning. If I'm part of an organization where I feel like people support me, and I was just watching Michael Lewis's The Blind Side with the great phrase, "got your back," right? If I just have that feeling in my head, I have low levels of cortisol, right? Just walking around in an organization like the people who manage me have my back, right? And I will have a stronger stress profile. Think about this finding in the context of your face-to-face meetings. This is an incredible study. We know one of the strongest predictors of a cortisol response, one of the best ways to amp it up in the lab, is to make people give a public speech that they didn't anticipate giving, right? In fact, Americans rank giving public speeches the second most anxious, anxiety-producing thing in life, right after dying. And if you die while you're giving a public talk, you're doing it all, right? And literally you can bring someone in and they're like, "Thanks for coming to the lab. In this experiment, you're going to give a public speech on abortion to those people over there." And all of a sudden, like, cortisol is revved up, right? And you're stressed out. In the study, if you just put a person in the lab who's listening to give the talk, and they make eye contact with you, and they go, and they nod their head, and they're like, "I'm with you, man. You're not going to die." Then they nod. You do not have a physiological stress response. That's how powerful the tools of social connection are. We've done a lot of studies of social connection. One of the great ways in which you create cultures of social connection is just by pats on the back, literally pats on the back and touch. I've done a lot of work on touch, and this is kind of the soft stuff of leadership. This was a study we did a few years ago to see if strangers could communicate the most important emotions of social connection just by patting them on the arm. It's kind of a study you would do at Berkeley. What we did is we built this giant barrier in our lab. One person comes into the lab, sticks their arm through a hole in this barrier. It's kind of like the Twilight Zone, like, is it going to come back? And they're, okay, there it is. Another person has a list of emotions, and they just reach out and touch an emotion and try to communicate different emotions by touching the forearm. I get that touch, and I try to guess what just happened, right? In this study, chance guessing is 8.5%. And what you find is you're able to communicate things like compassion and gratitude and love 7 or 8 times the level of chance guessing, just with the simplest pat on the arm, right? Pretty remarkable. We now know from the neuroscience of this, just the pat on the back, that I feel calmer, less stress response, I'm more creative, I'm more cooperative, just through this language of touch. I'm obliged to describe a couple of gender differences that we observed. We had all gender combinations of women touching women and men touching women and men. When the woman tried to communicate anger to the man, he got nothing right. He had no idea what she was doing. And then, regrettably, when the man tried to communicate compassion to the woman, she got 0 right. She was like, that was weird. I don't think that was a human being, or whatever it was. So, and you guys can figure that out on your own. But this is just, and I'll show you another study on how important, this is just the stuff by which, with the shaking of the hands, the pat on the backs, whatever the language of touch is in your workplace, it builds up strong team. All right. The second, this just shows you how important touch is in building trusting teams. It's very fitting for, we actually, there's a neat literature on how a lot of this socially intelligent stuff like touch and compliments builds up strong, cooperative, effective teams. And my grad student, Michael Krause, and I are longtime pickup basketball players. Ruined my knees after 25 years. And I actually, it started with this really interesting conversation we had where I was telling Michael, like, I have played 3,000 pickup basketball games in my life, in all over the world, in France and England and different parts of the United States. Does anybody play pickup basketball here? Okay. And what I discovered is in those 3,000 games of big people crashing into each other and hurting each other's bodies, I have never seen a fight, right? That is a lower level of violence than finding parking in Berkeley, right? Shopping at the Berkeley Bowl. You guys remember Berkeley Bowl? I've seen people break out in fisticuffs over bok choy. That's one, and I was like, isn't that remarkable? You've got these people crashing into each other, and yet there's so much goodwill. And our argument was, it's the language of touch. So here's what we did. Berkeley undergrads, I should say, really did this. They spent about 9 months coding all of the touch of every team in the NBA at the start of the 2008 season for one game. On average, a basketball team will touch each other for about 1 minute and 40 seconds during a game. And you guys see it if you watch a game. They're like, they're doing all kinds of stuff, free throws. And this is what they do, just to give you a sense of the data. High fives, fist bumps, arm embraces, bear hugs. I made an interesting discovery, which is, you can take this to your workplace. When men want to approve of each other, they very often kind of rap each other on the head. Nice job. And that's sort of a compliment. Arm embraces. There's the chest bump, the flying hip bump. And then when everything's going well, we would discover these operatic flying chest bumps. I've tried to get my faculty to do this on good days. It's not going so well. But that's, now this is what's really cool. This is, we found that the great leaders of basketball teams do a lot more touch, right? The best toucher in the NBA, many of you probably don't follow the NBA. Anybody have an idea? He's not as good. This 2008, 2009. He was high up. It was Kevin Garnett. Kevin Garnett is just, you just watch him play, and he was always sort of fist bumping. When he shoots a free throw, he was the first one. He leans forward, gets 2 fist bumps, leans back, gets 2 fist bumps. Here's what we found. The more the team did this cooperative, trustworthy stuff, the better they played at the end of the year, coding for every imaginable confound, like how much money they were making, preseason expectations. Were they winning during the game that we coded? Control for that. And just this language of team, and we had phenomenal basketball statistics of the money ball variety, of sort of efficiency and the like. It just created more efficient play. All right. I want to talk about, I only have 5 minutes left. So we'll end on, I'm going to get you guys to gratitude and then storytelling, since you brought up getting stressful. How do you guys practice gratitude in your organizations? Sort of expressing appreciation for what people do?
Send somebody 1,000 reward points, say thank you.
Yeah.
Things like that.
Nice. What else?
At Google, they have something called Duke. It's like a weekly department get together, and then it's very informal. There's no monetary reward. It's just somebody raises their hand and tells a story about somebody else helping them out. And then it's, somebody is crowned the Duke of the week.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's pretty
very
good.
informal.
That's cool.
It's very fun.
Yeah, that sounds good. I bet. Yeah.
Buy lunch for everybody in the office.
Yeah. Eating together, right? It's one of the oldest rituals humans have that builds up camaraderie. What else?
I think I work for Salesforce, where they have work.com, which is a new thing where you can give badges to people. So it's got thank you badges, and we went above and beyond. There's a bunch of badges, like 30 badges. You can just give badges to people, and everybody can see it in the company.
Nice.
So that's one new way of incentivizing people.
Nice. These are great. I love asking the question because there's often cultural variety. Julie and I worked with this team from Brazil. Gratitude in Brazil, you should practice it someday. The Brazilians are full of love and delight. literally one guy's like, well, they brought the 800 people in the organization in this giant room. We all had lunch. I stood on this table. The spotlight shined on me. The Samba line came by and everybody kissed me. And I was like, that's gratitude, right? But these versions are important as well. And all I'll tell you is, Adam Smith, the great economist, said the core glue of organizations is gratitude. It's just building up these thank yous and badges and expressions of appreciation and nice emails and thank you notes. And what we now know from a lot of different studies is if I can just get into the grateful mindset or feel like somebody's expressing gratitude towards me, I feel happier, I have a better health profile. Weeks later, I'm more productive, I'm more likely to stick with a team, I'm more likely to build up cooperative collaboration with others. It's just one of these kind of magical emotions to cultivate in the workplace through things like expressing appreciation, saying what you're grateful for, encouraging gratitude reflections in your workers or the people you're collaborating with. Very powerful tool. All right. I want to just end on this one because one of you brought it up. And it's one of these very subtle parts of leadership. Often it's hard. When I start hearing about the personal complexities of my graduate students' lives and postdocs and visiting scholars' lives, I'm like, does this help our science? I'm not convinced, right? But it turns out it does. And that's the importance of taking a moment to just engage in stories of the kind that you described, like someone's, having struggled with a problem at work or even a personal dimension or not fitting into the narrative of the company. All organizations have stories and narratives like Berkeley and the like. And this is incredible work, which is Jamie Pennebaker studies people who are going through the most stressful parts of their lives, right? They have a disease, brings them to the lab. They're going through a divorce. There are college students and they're bumping up against final exams. They have lost loved ones to death, right? And they're going through bereavement. Jamie brings them into the lab, gets pre and post measures, and he has two simple conditions. He either has people think about what's stressing them out and write kind of the facts of the matter. What time did this happen? How long, et cetera. Or he has them tell a story, right? Just tell me about kind of the emotional stuff of your divorce or the death of your wife or the physical disease you're struggling with. They write a story about it. And in every study, and he just has a book out, just getting people to tell the story quiets that stress response that we've talked about, right? This is just a profile of some of the effects he observes, more well-being, better immune system function. If you're fighting a disease, you have a higher killer T cell count. You're more creative. You're less vulnerable to anxiety or depression. Just every happiness and health indicator that we've kind of talked about today, just getting people to tell the story of the difficulty is good news for that. How do you guys tell stories in the workplace? Yeah.
Facts, telling it happened to me on this day, and telling a story. Like, what are some of the key differences?
Well, it's been hard to capture scientifically, but Jamie really thinks that, and there's a newer literature on this, that stories make you feel connected, first of all, but they give you this perspective, right? And it's almost this mystical quality of telling a story about the death of a loved one is you feel like you have perspective on the stress. And we know from various new studies that if I can kind of take a third person's perspective on what's stressful for me, step out of it a bit, get some distance, I do a lot better. And that's what the story does. Is it kind of gives you a way to look at, the difficulty in your life or the person you're managing, the difficulty in their lives. And he's got data on that thesis.
Tell that same narrative to a person who is in power versus not power, do you still get the same response? How much does it depend on the person who's listening?
Yeah, that's a terrific question. We don't know. And that would be what's your hypothesis?
I think it does matter.
Yeah. How so?
It's just like the example you gave. If you give a public speech and there's somebody who's sitting there nodding, that makes a big difference on your cortisol response. Right?
Yeah, yeah. No, that's a really neat idea. No one studied that. It's too bad. It's interesting teaching this for 15, 20 years. I mean, well, how do you guys wear stories in your very busy lives in the work that you do? How do you build it in? You've kind of talked about it just comes at you, right, as a necessary part of being a CEO.
I tell stories a lot about our customers.
Yeah.
And
awesome.
Back to you go meet customers, then you go back to employees and tell stories, and that creates connection between the employees and the customers and me and the employees.
Yeah.
Is a huge way that I use stories.
That's nice. And people love the stories of the organization, right? Like where does the scientific finding come from? What's the lineage of the scientists? How else do you guys weave stories into the organization?
Similar, but we actually have everybody on our team call a customer every week. So they get a story directly from the customer, and then we have a shared discussion around, whether it's on a Google Doc or every once in a while we just chat about it.
Yeah, nice. Other opportunities or places where stories arise?
Satisfied customer, have them tell the story themselves, fly them in.
Yeah, wow.
And talk to the team.
Cool. Yeah.
With numbers, rather than just giving people numbers, creating the story around the numbers so that they have something more relatable.
Yeah.
But I also think there's a quality of leadership with the narrative, because you're leading somebody down the path. There's a beginning, middle, and end versus just talking about facts and bullet points. And so having those three qualities also gives them a sense of wanting to go along with you. And so then you start getting into the power of being able to bring somebody up and bring them down through the context of the story.
Right. That's nice. That our work lives are almost like novels, right? And have these beginnings and middles, and to get the individual to situate him or herself in that narrative is powerful. Yeah.
I think there's some pretty powerful storytelling that goes on, certainly between women in the workplace.
Yeah.
And when you started talking about work-life balance just then, I tend to I've been to a class similar to this years ago, and I got given the feedback that I should tell more of my own personal stories.
Yep.
So I try and exchange stories, especially with women, and especially with women. I deal with a lot of our MBA students here and people who are sort of don't have kids yet, and I try and tell some of my work-life balance stories in exchange for some of their stories. And I don't know if it works, but I'll maybe ask them.
I think it does. So, this certainly is something we can lean on. So we've talked about happiness and how important it is, and I hope for those when you encounter skeptics or you question whether we should be concerned about it, there's a rock-solid science behind that. We talked about power and how kind of this more impulsive, coercive style of leadership costs individuals and teams in terms of happiness. Talked about the alternatives or the antidotes. I like your term a lot about things like connection and gratitude and trust and telling stories and being optimistic. I apologize for having gone over a little bit, but I know when I say I'm sorry, you'll like me even more. And that's a finding, and thanks for being here at Berkeley and coming back, and I'll take your question after. So come on up after if you have questions. Thank you.